Now, yeah, here we go. I'll just invite you to give your name and who you work with, and then, guys, if you can speak into the microphone, because I'm going to hand over the roving mic.
Kieran Ryan, I work with myself as a ecologist. Just like to ask Nathy on, has there been that much done on using floodplains, I mean natural and maybe developing floodplains? I know that would mean compensation for farmers, but I think would that not give greater opportunity for controlling floods?
Today, Kieran, probably not that much is the short answer. Usually it takes a lot of land. That's one thing we find from my knowledge. So I know the time, let's say I showed Ennis has got flood defence, typical high walls going through the town. I think at the time they calculated they needed something like 5,000 acres upstream of Ennis to kind of hold the 100-year flood. Just couldn't, with the lie of the land, they just couldn't kind of get enough land use there without getting into awful kind of work associated houses and properties. So usually it's more to do with, you need big areas is the problem, yeah. To take the top off the 100-year flood in simple terms, it takes a lot of storage. And this is, so it's usually just this, scale.
But just following on from that, one of the things that struck me was that Tom had talked about, they've identified that they need to plant a certain hectarage in the UK or in England, in Wales. I mean, have you put a figure on that yourselves?
No. We do need kind of some sort of demonstration sites. There is this research, but Ireland needs some sort of kind of pilot or demonstration sites to see. So I think a lot of people are starting to think the same way to try and move ahead with it. Yeah.
Hi, Owen O'Keefe. I'm an ecologist with Ronan O'Donovan. Following on the same theme, you talked a lot about the 1 in 100 year events, which are, as it says on the tin, once in a lifetime event, more than likely.
That's incorrect. That's it. I have to stand up and just basically, sorry, Mary Trinity College Dublin, it's never a once in a lifetime event. The one is a statistical probability, it's a 1%.
Well, exactly, that's why I say on average.
Any year and every year there's a 1%.
We understand that, and that's why I said on average. So.
Thanks for the clarification, but just sort of try and wait it out. I know sometimes you're dying to.
But in any case, it's acknowledged that those are extreme events. And most people who are affected by flooding are probably more concerned with the shorter return period events, which cause them repeated damage, perhaps every year. And do you have any information about the effectiveness of those measures for those shorter return period events, say 1 in 25?
We find out the same. We do a lot of public exhibitions. People generally look for the 100-year flood. I know it sounds funny, but the big ones that cause the big economic damage. So the first big thing you have is the Insurance Federation of Ireland. So for them to give house insurance in the Irish state, they've agreed with government to want a 100-year flood defence. Basically, they're not going to give flood insurance. That's the first kind of commercial standoff. But we generally find people that are flooded, they want the big defence. I know it sounds, they're not so worried about the 25-year flood as the 100. They want protection. I suppose in 2009, 2015, certain catchments in Ireland had 2 100-year flood events, 6 years apart. So as Mary is saying there, that it's, it looks like these storms are getting bigger and people are very worried about them. But in saying that, I don't have actually figures on the 25-year, but it is a bit of a dilemma for OPW that our scheme designs for 100-year defences, and we go in, I suppose, on behalf of the Irish state. The town has to be left with a 100-year flood defence. That's kind of the. That's
is it worth at some point accepting that if you live in a certain area, there is going to be a risk? There's always a risk, and there's a certain amount of risk just have to be accepted.
No, I accept your point. Yeah.
Sorry, this gentleman.
Kevin Keary, Forest Service, Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. I have a question, and I have 2 questions actually. First question is, do you think there's an argument to be made for compulsory planting in riparian strips? And just your opinion on that. And the second question I have is to Tom. With regards to the silviculture of planting on floodplains, isn't there an elevated risk that, say, for example, establishment won't occur, and if, say, a flooding event happens and washes away the new trees, etc., etc., how do you manage that risk, and what do you put in place to try and avoid those pitfalls? etc., like spacing or whatever other types of techniques you use?
Okay, I'll try and answer both of those questions. I mean, starting with the second one, that is a real issue. I mean, we've come up when we're trying to persuade landowners to plant woodland in the floodplain. They are naturally resistant. They highlight the risks they face and cite the very example you've given. What happens if it gets washed out? And really, there's not much we can do about that. It's a risk, and so yes, they would be obliged to replant to beat up the crops. So it's a cost to them, and I suppose it can only be dealt with by having to increase the incentive, the level of grant to partly deal with that risk. So yeah, that's just the way it is, I think, in terms of management. The first question was that's an important one. I mean, the water regulatory authorities have got the power under the Water Framework Directive to prohibit certain activities. They can identify water protection zones, and within those zones, they can prohibit activities like fertilizer or pesticide use. So, in principle, that is possible. Obviously, it's politically sensitive. I don't think many countries have used. We've got one water protection zone in England, I think. But yes, that remains the case. If they can't deliver, meet these targets, then that may be the logical option. I mean, the other thing is just to say that in terms of the costs of selling foodstuffs, they don't properly reflect the damage that's being done to the environment, be it the soils, be it water quality. So maybe if that was incorporated, our food is too cheap, in inverted commas. If that was incorporated, they could get income that could then be used for woodland creation and such like.
Mary.
Thank you. Mary Burke, Trinity College Dublin. So I wanted to speak to the very good question that came from the man I very rudely interrupted at the beginning about the lower magnitude floods. And the data is out there that basically, yes, the so-called natural flood management is very effective at those lower magnitude floods and for smaller catchments. And so the OPW have been given this order, wherever it's come from, to deal with the 100-year flood. There's this concept of a nuisance flood, and they occur more often, and the cost of the nuisance flood over that 10 or 20-year interval exceeds the cost of the 100-year flood. So there's the economic rationale in involving. And just one further point that was brought up about forests and riparian forests and floodplain forests. The planting or forests for floods is not... it's not basically a cure, because the research that's been done in the UK has shown that sometimes... How are you? Sorry. So the research that's been done in the UK has shown that sometimes when you plant floodplains with forests, it can actually exacerbate your flood problem because it attenuates the flow on the floodplains, slows it down, so that once where catchments in a small catchments in a big catchment were asynchronous in terms of supplying that flood pulse down into the main stream, they're now all operating on the same time clock. So you're getting your pulse from all of the streams at the same time. So I would be a major supporter of native woodlands and forestry in alleviating floods, but there are issues with it that we need to consider and manage properly.
No.
Yeah, thank you. Jonathan Spatsy, Chagas Forestry Development. A question for Tom on payment for ecosystem services in relation to effective riparian, buffer riparian zones. You talked about a few measures. Could you tell us maybe a bit more in relation to the actual payment structure? How do you measure output and relate payment to that?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, what we've been finding in the project, although there are a number of schemes in different countries, Vitel is a notable one, water company, they don't, at the heart of them, they don't have a direct link between the benefit and what they're paying farmers to do. And that's what we're trying to improve on. And the way we see the best way of doing that is to take the results from studies that are out there that show that if you plant certain areas of woodland in the right place, you can reduce the delivery of these pollutants by a large margin, up to 90%. And so there are lots of studies that measure that. The difficulty is there's lots of factors that come into play. There's the width of the buffer, there's the slope, there's the way you manage it. But the more studies we can draw on, then we can deal with some of that variation, some of that uncertainty. So yes, if we can, we're starting to produce these lookup tables which draw on the studies across the world that show the effectiveness. Can we reduce it by 20%? 30% or 40%. And with that knowledge, we can then put a value on that reduction in terms of relating it to, well, it's something we're still discussing, whether it relate it to an a standard value or an indicator. And at the end of the day, yes, it's about working out the cost effectiveness of the measure. So for a given reduction in nitrate or pesticides, how cost effective is that in terms of the benefit to the water industry or the drinking water owner or a company, and that's what we're trying to pull together so that it's more seamless in terms of where that basic information is coming from.
And would you see this information leading to a working scheme?
Yeah, well, we've got working schemes. There are a significant number of working schemes across Europe. As I say, they're a bit smoke and mirrors in terms of getting exactly the payment for a specific benefit. And we're hoping that through the project, through the cost action, we'll be able to draw that information together that will say, well, here's in a range of case studies, here's the reduction achieved in terms of nutrient or pesticides. Here's our assessment of putting a value in that in terms of the end user. And then working that out in terms of a payment per hectare or a payment per hectare per year or putting it in some form that would be meaningful in terms of a grant or an incentive.
Okay, I have at the moment three. I had 3 questions. It looked like about 8 now, so I might try and reduce it to that 8.
Enda Mullen from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. I was very struck by a contradiction between our first speaker and our last speaker, which Mary was talking very much about planting trees close to river edges and the fact, that we've lost so many. And then in the LIFE project, we're talking about keeping them back from the river. Perhaps this is really about not so much about whether trees should be close to rivers or not, but what we do with the trees when they're close to the river, so that if we're cutting them eventually in the future, we're causing the siltation problems and so on for the likes of the pearl mussels. So I was just wondering if there is any comment from the team on that. Thank you.
I think it's working, yeah. I think I can comment on that. I think we're talking about 2 different types of planting. I was talking about planting of native deciduous trees, whereas I think you're talking about keeping the conifers away from the stream edge and maybe re-establishing native vegetation in the buffer strip.
Thank you. My name is Helen Lawless. I'm from Mountaineering Ireland, and my question is mainly directed towards Mary. You mentioned that riparian planting is not suited to high gradient peaty areas in the uplands. And as a hill walker, I can attest to the fact that quite a lot of rain falls on the hills, and I'm wondering what we can do to optimise the capacity of the uplands to help retain water and mitigate flooding. Thank you.
Okay, I'll attempt to answer that, although it's probably going back to a flooding measure. The reason I said that is that we shouldn't be planting extensively in the uplands, as the trees don't naturally occur there. Instead, we have the peat, which acts as a natural sponge. So if it is, I suppose, maintained in an intact condition, then it will to some extent reduce the flooding intensity. However, I think we probably do have to look at some natural measures of retaining water in the uplands, because the peat has been fragmented in many areas, and one possibility is to have those woody dams in place that might help to slow the flow. But maybe I'll hand it over to my colleague, might have some additional thoughts.
No, you've answered it perfectly. We've no huge, there hasn't been too much work done, but in fairness, Queech and Board Mona have done a certain amount of drain blocking. National parks have themselves, so there has been a certain amount of work done on reinstatement of bogs and that sort of stuff. That not sure of any major scientific study out of it. But again, any indication we have is that it will help with the smaller floods, but not the bigger flood. By the time the heavy rain comes, most of these measures are fully saturated and the same flow starts to come down the channel. That's our evidence to date.
I think on the peatland issue, there can be a drying out of the banks, then leading to cracking, and with the sort of higher surges of water, that has led to an increase in erosion of those peaty banks. So I think it's certainly something that might need interventions such as matting to stabilise initially, with some fertiliser use just to bring on the vegetation. I have three.
Hi there, I'm Keith. Welcome to Delgany. I'm local here along the Three Trout stream, further downstream. My question is for Nathy, but maybe the panel generally as well. One of the things I do, I'm a litter volunteer, clean up litter and pollution, and I've noticed it's very important when doing any flood works or other development to maintain the connection between the people, the community, and the river. Woods as well, but particularly between the people and the river. And I've seen small changes, small differences in floodworks can make a huge difference to that. For example, there's a very nice boardwalk recently done on the Dargle River here. Keeps the connection. People can see the river. Compared to that, some of the plans for the floodworks for the Dodder in South Dublin do not do that. They do not seem to take the best practice that seems to work well on the Dargle. So just any advice you could give us as a community trying to input and taking part in the consultations, but not really getting anywhere in influencing and inputting to keep that connection, if you agree with me that it's important to keep the connection between the people and the river. Thank you.
No, I think it's a big issue. In some ways it intertwines with a few things here. If you take the biggest example I have is Cork. You effectively have a social media campaign, Save Cork City, against OPW putting walls and damaging the heritage walls, the quays. So it's like this standoff. Half the population kind of want 100-year defence, and the commercial businesses in Cork are screaming for help and they can't get insurance. They want the place defended from big floods. And then, I suppose there is that softer side. Then you have this whole thing, if you start raising walls, you have this whole disconnection of humans in the river. You're driving everyone back from the river in some ways. So that's why I suppose even looking at natural flood management, looking at tidal barrages, all these options. But despite best efforts, we're getting funneled back down to walls again. It's this kind of constant standoff. It is, but we're kind of talking maybe less people accept it, the community generally accept, maybe go for 25-year flood protection, and then everything can start to reduce. What they've done in Pickering in that UK, effectively they seem to have the environmental agency has said to the community, you're not cost effective, they're not going to fund a 100-year flood defence scheme. This kind of measure evolved, and I think the community have accepted what they'd call 25-year flood defence. So they're happy enough if 100-year flood breaches and they're going to get flooded. It's a constant kind of dilemma in some ways. There's no easy solution, unless someone else has any brainwave, but...
Just to add to that, it's about managing risk at the end of the day, and I think the wider public, yourself, the communities understand that issue of risk. We led the Slowing the Flow at Pickering project, and the community were very supportive of working with natural processes. They understood that while the ideal would have been to get 100-year protection, it just wasn't going to work. They saw this green agenda. You know, they were in tune with the green agenda, and they were happy just to. It made sense to them to use more natural techniques to store and slow the water in the floodplain. So a measure that a lot of communities are using in England is putting wood in streams. Installing large woody debris dams. It's something they can do as a group, and you can certainly see that they work, and it's something that people feel they can get engaged with. Just a bit of a warning with that. Obviously, it depends on design, and we're still. Well, there's mixed debate about should we have standards, should we have recommended designs or not, because these dams do different things. But you need to be careful by using these debris dams. I think you need to have an eye to design to make them most effective, and you have to be careful they don't just get washed out and block downstream structures. But it's something we've certainly found that's something that communities are very keen to get on and do.
I'm going to have to cut it off with this last question. I'm sorry for all the other people up there that have burning questions, but I'm sure that each of the speakers will be happy to speak with you over coffee. And yourself?
Catherine, I feel special, thank you. Rory O'Connor from the Local Authority Waters and Communities Office. Just wanted to ask Naty in particular and Tom, scalable projects in an Irish context on either sub-tribs or larger within, relatively small catchments. But are we piloting? Is there ideas around piloting? I know you were up in Ishone, but are there ideas around taking a catchment and actually piloting work with landowners and looking at compensatory payments?
The short answer is no at the moment, but there is this, we'd hope it's going to start coming through this kind of interdepartmental working group. I mentioned about this integrated catchment management. So officially, I suppose Forest Service involved, OPW, various agencies. The plan is to get, I suppose, all these government departments sitting down. We need, in Ireland, there's general recognition, we need to get some pilot catchments going, get some sort of demonstration sites going. So even Mary the Burke was talking there from Trinity going to start up with doctors with ourselves. I'd mentioned that they're going to try and see work up with Queenschick, can they get some pilot grounds going. There's this call going out for research with the EPA. Just coincidentally, at the moment there's a lot going on, but everyone agrees we need to get a few pilot sites going in Ireland and try and demonstrate maybe whether it works or not.
Is there any DIPs that are currently underway for actual pilots ready to go rock and roll?
No, not that I know of, Rory. No. Ms. Tom, I don't know, you any from your experience?
No, I mean, it's what we need to do. I would say you need to just get on and do it. Demonstration studies are very powerful. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that in terms of people getting the messages, seeing how it works. There's lots of potential to integrate water quality with flood risk management to satisfy both WFD and Floods Directive. And yes, I would just recommend getting a few case studies, demonstration studies in place, because they're a real powerful tool for showing people how it works and how it can work. Just one thing I would just last to add, I mean, don't, while we've had some discussion there about natural flood management doesn't work for large floods in large catchments. It's not so much, from a process point of view, there's no cut-off, so to speak, in terms of that these processes stop working. It's about scaling up changes to make a difference at a large scale. It's very difficult to do in large catchments because there's lots of different things going on that can cancel each other out. Mention was made about synchronization, desynchronization. So basically, it's just that the jury's out. We don't have enough data because it's very difficult to do to show a change in a large catchment for a large flood. If your flood only comes along in once every 100 years, okay, it's not exact. If it's a 1% probability event, you don't tend to get many of those during a 5-year research project. So how do you prove a change? So don't count it out. There's no reason why, from a process understanding, they'll not work. It's just that you need to do a heck of a lot over a large area to make any difference.
Okay, thanks everybody. Just to sum up, I want to really thank the speakers. I was there in 2004 at the the Woodlands conference in GMIT, and riparian woodland, I think there was one presentation on it, and I mean, you just can't escape the pun. This is a growing area. You know, it's fantastic, and I know we're looking at it in Bordemona in terms of, you know, how we can incorporate woodland riparian management into our day-to-day practices. I think the key things there were connectivity, heterogeneity, translating the messages to the community. So, you know, as an ecologist, and generally ecologists and people working on woodlands, sometimes we forget that we need to communicate and translate the messages to the community. And I mean, we have some community representatives here today, and I know from our own work that that's often the greatest challenge, is actually translating our speak into on the ground. But communication is a two-way thing, so we have to listen as well. Thanks again. We'll reconvene at 4:00. And there'll also be a sort of a summary as well, facilitated by Paddy Woodworth. So thank you.